Hey everybody, Counthammer VHS here, and it is Wednesday once again, which means that according to the rule of alliteration, I am contractually obligated to bring you a Wainriders update for Wainrider Wednesday. Today, we are going to be looking at the tribes of the Harad. Their campaign maps start, but we wanted to start off by showing you some updates, actually, since the last episode, or since the last update, or the first one, rather, which featured Gondor. So you may remember a couple of weeks ago, we took a look at Gondor on the map, and there have been some changes since then. Now, again, as you will see and throughout this video, we are continuing to work on the mod, and so there are some things that remain to be done. We will, of course, be moving these resources from around the settlements. They're just there for convenience sake currently, and there are no doubt other minor things that will be adjusted as time goes on. And as sort of proof of that, we wanted to take just a couple of minutes at the beginning of this update to show you some of the things that are perhaps a little different in Gondor than you may have remembered. So for the first one, we can just look over here at Minas Ithil. And if I can get a little closer here, you may be able to detect that the tower looks a little bit different in this incarnation. I think it's a little more modest, not quite as large as it was initially, and it still boasts a very similar layout in terms of the settlement, but I think scale-wise it fits together better in this version. And if we go slightly to the northwest, we can see Caer Andros is now boasting a new fortification model. These are the permanent fort settlements that offer very limited building and typically command small areas with strategic importance. In the previous version, you may have noticed these had a much more tall tower structure at the upper part of the settlement. And here, again, those towers are much more modest, so they don't quite dominate the landscape as they did in the earlier versions. This model is going to be shared by the Dunedainic fortifications that you can find on the Anduin. If we go up here, just opposite the Brownlands, we've got a couple of these settlements occupying the crossings, and there are a few others to the west, which we'll take a look at, commanding the north-south road through what would later be known as Dunland, essentially. Now, these are not all of the Dunedainic-style fortifications you'll see on the map, but to take a look at those, you'll have to wait for the update where we focus on Arnor. One last thing we can look at here, if I'm remembering correctly, is Amon Anwar. Yes, right here. Now, this is the Tomb of Elendil, and here you can see it is a smallish tomb area. This would be a very inconspicuous site. Amon Anwar, I believe, translates into the hill or the mountain of awe, but that is not in reference to the structures that you would find there or to the height of the hill itself. I believe this has more to do with just the almost supernatural awe that you would feel if you were in the presence of Elendil's tomb. This is essentially a state secret. Very few people even know the location of this place, so a very sort of out-of-the-way, modest type of model for this seems certainly to fit. But now I think we can take a trip south of the Poros, south of the Harnen, in fact, to look at the starting position for the tribes of the Harad. Well, here we are south of the Harnen, just at the end, or one of the ends, of the Harad Road, and one of the first things you may notice here is the brand new campaign UI designed by Valor. And the design here is nice, unobtrusive, conveys the culture without being too in your face, gives the information, has nice symmetry to it, so very good stuff overall. Now, the other thing you're liable to notice is the depiction of Harad, kind of in keeping with the more lush-looking Harondor than you may expect. Harad, south of the Harnen, has a little bit more going on than you may remember from Dominion of Men, or maybe some other depictions of the region. As I mentioned in the video for the Western Horde, there are lots of blank spaces in Tolkien's maps that don't give any clue about terrain features or vegetation, but those should not be taken to interpret that there were no terrain features or vegetation at those blank spaces. And I think in the case of Harad, we have to imagine a fairly diverse and, of course, very large area. And so in this mod, we've gone with a more varied type of terrain and environments overall in Harad. Now, north along the Harnen, you're going to, of course, find more trees, more forested areas, and that largely holds true all the way to the coast. A little bit further to the south, you'll find more open plains. We can sort of zoom in a little bit here to get a closer look at these. More flat areas, but also some hills. And even at the very south of the map, some more pronounced hills, maybe even small mountain ranges, I suppose. And then to the east of these is where we find your true desert. This means that as the tribes of the Harad, you'll have a little more choice in terms of where you're doing fighting. Some of your units may be getting combat bonuses in the desert, so that will mean you'll maybe be more inclined to use them in certain areas. You'll have more opportunity to find higher ground with the more varied terrain and land masses, and there are even a few more streams and rivers in the south, giving you some opportunity to fight for some crossings and generally fight a more defensive war, depending on how your borders shake out. I could also take this opportunity to point out that the map here has been expanded slightly from Dominion of Men. If we go over into the west here, you may remember that in Dominion of Men, of course, here is the location of Umbar, and this was just about as far south as the map went. I think right about here was the edge of the map. But in Wainriders, we've expanded that a little bit into the south. That gives a little more action down here, a little more room for settlements, and some interesting terrain features. Now, this campaign UI, as well as the settlement models, I believe, are shared by the other Southron faction on the map, and that is in fact Khand. If you remember 4th Age Total War, Khand was grouped as a more Easterling or barbarian culture, but in Wainriders we're considering them, or we're grouping them in with the Southrons. We'll talk a little more about the reasoning behind that decision when we get to the video about Khand, but for now, what that means for the tribes of the Harad is that as you expand eastward and potentially find yourself in conflict with Khand, you may be able to make better use of their settlements because you will share that culture between you. But as for your starting position, in Wainriders, the tribes of the Harad are a much more modest group than the Empire of Harad was in the 4th Age Total War. Of course, in the 4th Age, we had imagined that Harad had expanded, had grown in power, and had assimilated into itself all these different groups, tribes, even the Corsairs of Umbar. All of that is well into the future, of course, from the perspective of this mod. At this point in history, the Haradrim had been at war and at peace with Gondor for many centuries already, but they had not quite yet coalesced into the truly formidable force that Sauron would be able to make use of in the War of the Ring. Towards the very end of the Wainrider period, though, 1944, that final invasion that took place both north and south of Mordor and attacked northern and southern Ithilien, we know that Haradrim were very much involved. These were the Haradrim who had fought against the Wainriders and later formed an alliance with them. As part of that alliance, they determined to strike north, going, of course, through Horondor and crossing the Poros to invade southern Ithilien. They were unsuccessful in that invasion, but the fact that the attempt was made does tell us that there was enough power or enough peace going on in Harad itself to allow such a campaign to take place. Now, the start date for the mod is about a decade after the Wainriders had established themselves in Rovanion, and so that campaign is a long way off, and of course things may not turn out exactly as the way they did in the lore. As the tribes of the Harad, you'll begin with these 4 settlements, stretching from the very southern borders of the map, even into some deserts, all the way up through the plains into the more forested, lush, and fertile territory along the Upper Harnen. But from here you'll have a choice. One of the things you'll notice about the starting position of the tribes of the Harad is that you will not actually border any other factions, at least how things are set up currently. That means you have a bit of time to decide exactly how and where you're going to invade, time to build up your forces before coming into contact with one of those major factions. Those major factions, again, will consist to your east of the people of Khand, and there'll be a bit of desert and plains and wastelands to get through before you encounter them, but this may be a pretty lucrative and straightforward path for you to take. Westward, on the other hand, is eventually Umbar, but this is currently in the hands of the men of Gondor, and all around it you will find remnants of the once great Corsairs. While these people are currently in exile, they are still a Dunedainic faction and should not be taken lightly. They will no doubt be expanding, possibly taking Umbar early on, or at least attempting to do so, and maybe grabbing some of these rebel settlements before you yourself can snap them up. One of the most consequential battles, therefore, in the south may well be over command of Umbar and its wealthy hinterland and coast. And so as the tribes of the Harad, you'll probably want to get involved in this war sooner rather than later to make sure one strong power doesn't emerge before you have anything to say about it. But another interesting theater is to the north, where Horondor is not really occupied by anybody. Certainly Gondor and the Corsairs do have somewhat of a presence here, but in both of those cases it is very minor. I think each of them only consists of a single province north of the Harnen and south of the Poros. While the tribes of the Harad themselves do not have any settlements north of the Harnen, it certainly would not take very much for you to begin that process and moving into this more fertile territory. And of course, if you want to avoid finding yourself at the might or the mercy of Gondor like your ancestors had in the days of High Armendakil I, you will want to make sure that Gondor or the Corsairs do not become dominant in this region and start to lord it over you. But let's now take a look at the settlements themselves. We've got, again, 4 to choose from here. I guess we can take a look at this desert one as a sort of an example of the lower tier, unwalled Haradrian settlements. This one, of course, has some nice vegetation around it, but you can see clearly here sort of the idea of a central temple structure, perhaps, domed and columned, but around that arrayed this rather chaotic jumble, perhaps, of what looks to be like mud buildings, maybe a few tents, and small structures. Going over to the west, we can see what a slightly larger version of this settlement looks like. Let's pick one that doesn't have a horse inside of it. Here we go. And so this one, not only does it have the dome, but we've also got a couple of, I guess they're cisterns, or maybe they are pools or something along those lines. The idea that, again, we're dealing with a people who are somewhat sophisticated, but they have not yet organized themselves into a truly formidable force that can by itself challenge the might of a strong Gondor. That, again, lies far off in the future, if it will ever come. But here you can see, again, perhaps a bit of that Gondorian influence. That domed, columned structure in the middle, to me, looks like maybe it's an echo of a Sauronic temple from ancient days. Maybe you can imagine the Black Númenóreans having taught the men of the south these ways of worship, perhaps, which they've maintained in some echo, some form down the long centuries. But here again, the other feature you may notice is outside the walls, beyond the towered walls here, we've got a few structures sort of clamoring for the protection of the settlement. They're not quite inside the structure. They've begun to sprawl outside of it. So Harad does offer an interesting duality, so to speak. It has a bit of everything in terms of its terrain, its initial starting position from the deserts to the rivers, and it has some very different units from what you may remember from Dominion of Men. At this point, again, I should remind everybody that we do have videos on the channel showcasing the units for all of the factions in the campaign. And so as the Haradrim, your troops are going to be a little more aggressive, a little less well-armed perhaps, but maybe more versatile than you may remember from Dominion of Men or other depictions of these people. It'll be really interesting then to sort of take Harad into a fully grown, powerful kingdom in its own right, so to speak. You won't have that position, that strong position to count on in the beginning of the campaign. The south is very much up for grabs, and it'll be up to you to decide which way you're going to go. East into the deserts, into the wastelands, going after Khand, or west against the more powerful Dúnedainic factions. Or indeed, maybe you'll seize the initiative quickly, driving through Horondor and all the way up into Ithilien. Well, I hope you've enjoyed this first look at the South. Again, a work in progress for the mod Total War Wainriders, a mod for Rome Total War's Alexander expansion, the original game, not the remaster. Every Wednesday, we will have updates on the mod that is going to continue to be campaign map stuff for the foreseeable future. I'm not quite sure which faction we're going to look at the start position of next, but we will be making that decision fairly shortly. So stay tuned for that, and as always, everybody, take care